The truth is going to sting a little, not because it's harsh, but because it's simple. The reason things haven't shown up isn't because they're far away, or because the universe is testing anything, or because something is missing. It's because the version of self that keeps wondering, questioning, hoping, and waiting is not the version that receives. That's the part most people miss. It's not about what's being done. It's about who is being. And until that self-image shifts, the reality can't. That's why manifestation feels hard sometimes. Because deep down, it's not about the thing that's wanted. It's about the identity of the one trying to get it. And that identity, that self-concept, is shaping everything. It's deciding what's possible, what's allowed, what's familiar, and what's safe. And until that self-concept says, this is already mine, life can't reflect it. So if the question is, why hasn't it happened yet? The answer is, because the story of self still says it's not here. Change that story, and the world has no choice but to catch up. When someone feels like nothing is working, when they've tried visualizing, scripting, affirming, staying positive, doing all the techniques, and still reality hasn't moved, it's not because they're doing it wrong. It's because the version of self that's doing all those things is still operating from the identity of someone who doesn't have what they want. That's the part that so many miss. Manifestation isn't about stacking technique after technique. It's not about forcing the outside world to change. It's about realizing that the outside world is already reflecting who someone believes they are on the inside. So as long as the inner self-concept is saying this is hard, or it's not working, or I don't know how, then that becomes the signal. And everything outside just matches it. It's frustrating because it feels like effort is being made, like something should be shifting. But what's really happening is that the doing is coming from a place of lack, from a belief that something is still missing. That's what keeps the result stuck in delay. Because no matter how powerful a method is, if it's being used to try to fix or chase or force reality to move, it's reinforcing the idea that something isn't already true. And that idea, that identity, is the real block. The self-concept hasn't shifted yet. That's why nothing is showing up. It's not because the desire is wrong or too big. It's because the story of self hasn't caught up to it yet. People are often taught to focus on what they want, but rarely are they told to check in on who they're being while they want it. And that's the most important part. Because reality doesn't respond to what's wanted, it responds to who's wanting it. And if that person is still waiting, doubting, or needing, then the experience that shows up will reflect more waiting, more doubt, and more need. It's not personal, it's just the law playing out exactly as it's designed. What's inside shows up outside. Always, the moment this is understood, everything starts to shift. The real work is not in doing more. The real work is in shifting into the version of self that already feels aligned with the outcome. That version doesn't need to rush. That version isn't confused. That version already feels like it's done, even if nothing outside has changed yet. And when that inner world is stable, the outer world has no choice but to follow. It always does, not because it's being forced, but because it's being reflected. That's the real reason it hasn't been working. Not because of effort, but because of identity. Shift that, and everything else moves with it. Self-concept is not just a trendy idea or something nice to think about. It's actually the core of every single experience in life. It's the background story that's been playing in the mind for so long that it feels normal, automatic, and true even when it's not. It's the internal blueprint that silently tells the mind and body who to be, what's possible, what's familiar, and what to expect. It's not something that only shows up during big moments. It's shaping every thought, every reaction, every decision, and every pattern. And most people don't even realize it's there because it's been running the show for years, even decades, completely unchecked. The way someone sees themselves, not in words but in feeling, becomes the filter through which life is experienced. So if the self-concept is built around being the one who's always waiting, or trying, or struggling, or hoping things get better, then life will reflect exactly that. It has to, because the world outside isn't random. It's mirroring back what's been stabilized inside. That's why two people can have the exact same situation but respond to it completely differently. It's not the situation that makes the difference, it's the self-concept. One person might see rejection and feel devastated. Another might see it as nothing personal and move on easily. That response is coming from the story of self, what's expected, what's assumed, and what's been accepted as truth. And the interesting part is, self-concept is rarely just one thing. It can be strong in one area and weak in another. Someone might feel confident and capable at work, knowing they'll succeed in their career, but feel unsure and insecure when it comes to relationships or money. That doesn't mean they're broken. It just means their identity is fragmented across different areas of life. And each of those fragments is creating its own results. That's why it's so important to become aware of the self-concept behind each subject. Not to judge it or criticize it, but to see it clearly, because once it's seen, it can be changed. Self-concept is not a fixed thing. It's built from repetition. The thoughts that were repeated over and over, especially during emotional moments, got accepted by the mind and became part of the identity. That's all it is, a collection of thoughts that were believed long enough to feel real. But if it was built from repetition, then it can be rebuilt the same way. That's the most empowering part. No one is stuck with the story they've been carrying. It can be changed. And the change begins the moment someone decides to pay attention to what's going on internally and chooses a new version of themselves, one that's aligned with peace, worthiness, love, and certainty. That new version isn't created overnight, but with enough repetition and care, it becomes just as real as the old one. And once it does, life starts to look completely different, not because anything outside suddenly shifted, but because the one experiencing it did. Changing self-concept is not complicated, but it does take commitment. That's where most people get confused. They think transformation has to be dramatic, difficult, or mysterious, like some secret method has to be discovered or some powerful technique has to be mastered. But that's not the case. It's actually very simple, the same way the current self-concept was created. By repeating thoughts and beliefs over and over is the exact same way a new one can be formed. It's just repetition, practice, and a willingness to be consistent even when the outside world hasn't caught up yet. That's the real work, not in changing circumstances, but in staying loyal to the new identity even before there's evidence. At the center of this process is something called a mental diet. And a real mental diet isn't just about thinking positively or trying to suppress negativity. It's about taking full responsibility for the inner world and no longer letting old, unwanted thoughts run wild. It means being aware of what's being allowed to play in the background of the mind and choosing, every single time, to shift the narrative when it goes against the version of self that's being claimed. That means catching the thoughts that say it's not working or this is too hard or I always mess it up and replacing them with something that actually matches the new self-concept. Not just once, not just when it feels easy, but over and over until it becomes automatic. This might sound like a lot at first, especially when the old thoughts have been playing on repeat for years. But here's the truth, those thoughts only feel real because they've been repeated for so long. They've been practiced without effort. And if that much time and energy has gone into unconsciously repeating a painful self-image, imagine what happens when that same energy is redirected towards something empowering. That's where the shift begins, not in trying to erase every negative thought, but in making the new thoughts louder, stronger, and more familiar. And it's not about pretending. It's not about forcing beliefs that don't feel true. It's about gently but firmly redirecting the mind toward the identity that already has what's wanted. That identity exists. It's already inside. It's just been buried under a bunch of mental clutter and old stories. And the only way to bring it to the surface is through repetition, saying the new truth over and over, feeling it, leaning into it, letting it settle into the nervous system until it becomes the new normal. It takes patience, but not as much time as most people think. In fact, the shift can happen much faster than expected when there's real consistency. Not because the outside world changed first, but because the mind finally stopped arguing with what was already true. The new self was always there. It just needed to be chosen. And once it is, the world has no choice but to mirror it back. At first, changing self-concept can feel like a full-time job. The old thoughts come up fast, out of nowhere, and sometimes it feels like the mind is fighting back. That's completely normal. When someone begins this work, it's like interrupting a program that's been running automatically for years, and the mind doesn't love being interrupted. It's used to the old identity. It's used to the version of self that reacts the same way, expects the same things, and assumes the same outcomes. So when that's challenged, even with love and good intention, there's resistance. Thoughts like this is fake, or this won't work, or who do you think you are, might come up. That's not a sign something is wrong. That's a sign something is changing. And the good news is, this part doesn't last forever. In fact, it doesn't even last long. Once the decision is made to fully commit to a new identity, to genuinely step into a new story and stay there no matter what, the mind starts to catch on. It doesn't fight as hard. It doesn't cling to the old voice the way it used to. The thoughts that used to feel so believable start to lose their grip. They show up, but they don't land the same way. They don't have the same emotional weight. That's the turning point. That's when everything starts to feel lighter, not because the outer world has suddenly shifted, but because the inner world is no longer running on autopilot. What's really happening is that the new self-concept is becoming familiar, and that's the only reason it starts to feel easier. Not because it's magic, not because something snapped, but because the mind adapts to repetition. That's what it's always done. It adapted to the old story because that's what it heard every day. So when the new story is repeated with enough consistency, it adjusts again. It stops questioning. It starts accepting. And eventually, it starts offering those new thoughts automatically. The idea of being loved, supported, successful, peaceful, confident, it starts to feel natural instead of distant. And when that happens, the nervous system begins to relax. There's less tension, less grasping, less emotional charge. The body catches up to the mind. and life starts to feel different even before the outer circumstances change. And then something even more powerful happens. The outside does change. People respond differently. Opportunities show up. Things start to fall into place. But it doesn't feel shocking anymore. It doesn't feel like some rare coincidence. It feels normal because the identity has already shifted. It's no longer about hoping for the change. It's about expecting it. Not in a forced way, but in a calm, quiet, grounded way. That's the result of a steady mental diet. That's what makes this work so transformational. Not because it changes the world directly, but because it changes the lens through which the world is seen. And once that lens is clear, life starts reflecting something entirely new, without the push, without the struggle, and without the doubt. The truth about manifestation is that it was never about the technique, the vision board, or how perfectly a method was followed. It's always been about the identity, the inner self-concept that everything is filtered through. People often get so caught up in the steps, the timing, the how-to part of manifesting that they forget where the real power is. And the real power has always been within the story that's being lived out in the mind every single day. Because at the end of the day, the universe doesn't respond to what someone wants, it responds to who someone is being. It responds to the assumptions that are held, the expectations that feel natural, and the thoughts that have become habitual. This is why someone can say affirmations all day long but see no change, while another person barely does anything and yet life starts to shift quickly. It's not because one person is better or luckier. It's because one of them is speaking from belief, while the other is speaking from doubt. One of them has already accepted the new self-concept as truth, while the other is trying to force a new reality while still holding on to the old one. That inner contradiction is what causes delay. It's not the technique, it's the energy behind the technique. And that energy always comes from the identity. If the identity still feels like the one who's trying to make something happen, then the experience will reflect more trying. If the identity feels like the one who already has it, already is it, already lives it, then life has no choice but to match that. What most people don't realize is that the shift doesn't start on the outside. It starts in the quiet, unseen moments, in the conversations that happen in the mind when no one's watching. That's where the change happens first. That's where the old story loses its power. When the new self is chosen again and again, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when the evidence isn't there yet, that's when the bridge of events begins to unfold. Not because anything was forced, but because something was finally accepted. Manifestation isn't about controlling reality. It's about aligning with the version of self that no longer needs to. The version that trusts. The version that doesn't chase or beg or wait. The version that knows. And that knowing doesn't come from logic or from the five senses. It comes from inner conviction. It comes from deciding that the old way of thinking is no longer welcome and that the new story will be honored, no matter what appears in the short term. That's what makes this process so powerful and so simple at the same time. The entire life someone is living is just a reflection of who they've accepted themselves to be. Change that, and everything else changes too. No exception. And the beautiful part is, that power has always been there. It was never missing. It was just buried beneath years of stories that didn't belong. But once those are dropped and the new self is allowed to take the lead, manifestation becomes natural. Not because something new was added, but because the truth was finally remembered. So if things have been feeling stuck, or if nothing seems to be changing no matter what's being done, maybe it's time to stop searching for the next technique and start getting honest about the version of self that's been running the show. Because that version, that quiet self-concept behind every thought, is the only thing that's ever been in the way. And the moment that's rewritten, life responds. Not because anything outside has been forced, but because the inside finally came into alignment with what's always been available. If this message stirred something, let it land. Sit with it. And if you've already started rewriting your story, share your experience in the comments. You never know who might need to read it today. Your words might help someone finally shift their entire reality.